Welcome to The Johnson Way, a show about exploration and finding your own path. I'm Angie, and I'm here today with Aaron Baker, who is the wholesale manager at Water Avenue Coffee in Portland, and he's here to talk about traveling for coffee.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks for having me on.
Sure, toodoo bang. That's their sort of what's up, right?
Yeah, I heard that a lot when I was down in Brazil.
Well, let's just jump right into it then. How about we start with how you got into coffee in the first place?
I got into coffee back in 2005 because I graduated from college and was broke and needed a job. So I got a gig as a barista. A friend of mine was working in a coffee shop, and he was able to get me a job there, and I loved it.
And it grew from there.
Yeah.
So since then, you've gone up from being barista, and right now you're all the way to the wholesale manager. Because of that, you've actually done a couple trips down into South America and Central America to visit the farmers. Is that right?
I have. I've gotten to travel to both Colombia and Brazil. Colombia in 2012 and Brazil in November 2013.
And is the goal for that, so that you can go and see the source and meet the farmers?
Absolutely. A lot of it I do for my own professional education, but it's a value to Water Avenue Coffee to send me there because I can better relay the information about the coffee to the customers who are buying it here. I can help translate some of the differences and some of the realities of what coffee is to us here in the Portland area.
I imagine that each year it's completely different depending on the crop. And so do you guys always send somebody down annually for those differences?
For the farms we're working with consistently year in and year out, we try and go down right at harvest time so we can taste the coffees right as they're coming off the patios and right as they're being milled. Because, the coffee is different every single year. No farm produces the same coffee year in and year out. It's very similar, but it changes, and we want to make sure we have coffees that fit the profile we want, and we want to be able to kind of snag the cream of the crop while we're down there.
When exactly is harvest?
It's different in every country. Colombia and Brazil harvest twice a year, the main harvest being kind of in October in Colombia and May to June in Brazil. And working north, it gets kind of later in the year. El Salvador, their harvest varies year to year, but it's December to March, depending on the year.
So when we were in Brazil, I think we're right at the tail, right before harvest, I think. Mm-hmm. And we entered Brazil via Peru. Mm-hmm. And I remember even in Ecuador and Peru, you would see everywhere we went, just one guy who had a tarp on the side of the road or a tarp on his roof and was barefoot walking on these beans, raking them, just drying them in the sun. It seemed like everybody was doing a little bit of that.
In Peru in particular, there's a lot of small coffee farmers. In countries like Brazil, they're very large coffee farms. There are farms in Brazil that produce almost as much as the entire country of Peru does. Brazil itself accounts for a third of the world's coffee production, whereas Peru is maybe 1%. There's a huge variety in all the different types of coffee farms that are out there. There's some of these massive industrial scale farms, but there are also farmers who just have a couple hundred trees in their backyard and just produce maybe one bag of coffee a year. But there are other farms that are producing in the millions of bags.
Huh. Well, that would make sense. I think some of the people we saw were along the one bag.
Absolutely.
Well, do you mind telling us how long each trip was when you were down there?
Each of my trips was about a week and a half. 10 days to, I think one was 12 days.
That's really quick.
Yeah. It was very quick. And that week and a half included the travel time. So I think my trip to Brazil, I think I had 5 days actually in Brazil. And then I had to turn around and get back on a plane and get back up here.
That's really fast.
Yeah.
Outside of meeting the farmers and getting educated on their beans, you really don't have a lot of time to get out and see much of the rest of the country.
Unfortunately not. This last trip I took to Brazil, of those 5 days I was there was a travel day in Brazil itself, and then 3 days in a cupping lab at the co-op's headquarters where we were just tasting coffee for 10 hours a day. Literally, we'd wake up at 7 in the morning and have breakfast at the hotel and walk down the street to the cupping lab and not come back until 6 at night.
What part of Brazil were you in?
I was in a small town called Carmo de Minas in the state of Minas Gerais, which is near Sao Paulo, about 2.5 hours kind of northwest of there.
Okay. And you mentioned the co-ops. So how exactly do you choose the farmers that you work with?
At Water Avenue Coffee, we're really kind of focused on finding farmers that are producing the most exceptional coffees from each region. Those farmers tend to be kind of larger scale farmers. And the ones that we work most closely with tend to be the ones who have a portion of their operation here in the United States. The co-op that I visited in Brazil, one of the co-op members actually lives in Seattle. And
that's a surprise. They don't like coffee up there.
No, not at all. And for most of his professional career, he was actually in the printing industry as a screen printer. But his family owns a couple of coffee farms, and he would import the coffee from his family's farms and then eventually from the farms of other people in the co-op that his family belongs to. He's kind of gotten out of the printing business and is selling green coffee here in the Northwest now.
These farmers, I know that, there's always the push for fair trade and organic, but it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't think people outside of coffee really understand that.
I think a lot of people inside coffee don't really understand it either. It's a really complex issue. Fair trade in particular has gotten harder to understand over the last half dozen years. Transfair USA, the certifying agency, has made some somewhat controversial decisions that have kind of excluded some of the smaller scale producers from the fair trade labeling. They've kind of shifted some of their focus to larger co-ops, and to actually be certified fair trade, you have to be part of a registered co-op.
So at that point, is it just political? Is it because money is backing those decisions?
I think that there's some politics involved, and this is me speaking personally, because this is getting into a little more controversial area. But I think there's some politics involved, but I think a lot of it has to do with what segment of the market they're looking to capture. The fair trade labeling is really seemed to be focusing more on larger macro roasters as opposed to smaller micro roasters, folks like the Starbucks and Peet's and Tully's. It seems to be that's where the push within fair trade and getting those coffees labeled fair trade seems to be. There's a little bit less incentive to get smaller scale roasters like Water Avenue Coffee certified fair trade.
The rough thing about that, in my personal opinion, is that at that point, they're just seeking the label. It isn't about quality. And that's unfortunate because I guess I didn't mention at the beginning of the podcast, moving to Portland, I was never a coffee drinker. And now I find that I am so over-caffeinated because there's just so much great coffee. And I didn't know anything about coffee till I moved here. And now I'm understanding a lot more. And so the quality, I think, is so important. But it's unfortunate to hear that.
And the organic and fair trade certifications have nothing to do with quality. A lot of roasters I know tend to not buy organic and fair trade because the quality is lower. The farmers spend their resources getting those certifications as opposed to taking care of their plants. That's not to say that there aren't great organic and fair trade coffees out there. They're just much harder to come by, and that's especially true in the case of Brazil. There's almost no organic coffee of quality coming out of Brazil these days.
Well, you're saying no certified organic. There's probably a lot of coffee that is technically organic, but it's just these farmers can't afford that certification.
I think that's a fair statement. There's a lot that goes into getting certified that is hugely resource intensive. One roaster I worked for back in the East Coast, just to get them certified, the bookkeeping side of it almost required a full-time position, and that's just for a small roaster.
And that's hard when you're just a little business trying to survive.
Exactly. And most coffee farmers don't want to put the resources into getting that certification. Larger co-ops can band together and certify their members, but individual farmers who are really trying to market their own farm's produce as opposed to their region's produce have a really tough time of it. There are some other certifications out there like Rainforest Alliance that tend to hold a little more value, in my opinion. Instead of being focused on a single aspect of the production chain like labor or chemicals, they kind of look at it globally. To be a Rainforest Alliance certified farm, you have to adhere to certain labor standards, you have to adhere to certain environmental standards, and you have to be a steward of the environment.
And those are all good things that we should strive for as individuals.
Exactly.
Well, and some of these farmers, I know you've been down to be with them. Have they been able to come up here? Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. And I'd say the farmers get up here more than we get to visit them down there, especially the ones we work with that have representation here in the States. A couple of the El Salvadorian farmers that we work with, have gone to school up here in the States, and, their family lives up here. The Menendez family in particular, one of the Menendez brothers lives here in Portland and travels down to El Salvador regularly to visit with the brother who's managing the farm and the father who's running the farm.
And to get away from the rain, I don't know.
Yeah, something like that.
To get away from our winter.
And then the Brazilian folks I was mentioning who live in Seattle, they bring their neighbors up here for the trade shows, and they were actually in our cafe, I think it was Wednesday of last week. We got kind of 15 Brazilian guys descending on us at once.
When you are down there, can you walk us through, Brazil was 5 days, and so it must have just been packed. What is it that you're doing with your time?
It's a little different on every trip, honestly.
Okay.
The Brazil trip, I was really there to taste coffee and pretty much taste coffee only. A importer that we had worked with a little bit up here arranged for me to be part of a panel of cup tasters down at this co-op's internal quality competition. So I was there literally just tasting coffee for 10 hours a day in a lab setting. They'd set out tables of 10 coffees for us to taste and score and judge and grade. The other judges were all what are called Q graders, which is certified coffee tasters. All Brazilian Q graders too, which was interesting because none of them really spoke any English at all. But we would just sit there and taste coffee. We'd finish a table of 10 coffees, have a little break to discuss the coffees, and they'd bring out the next set of 10.
When do you get to the point where they're blending together, and how do you cleanse your palate between those?
For me personally, around coffee, 60 to 70 is when they start blending together.
Jeez. That is so much.
The day before I got there, they did 120 coffees, and I was just in awe of that.
That's amazing. That's a very refined palate.
Yes. Brazilian coffees are especially hard for me to taste the subtle differences into, because I shouldn't say they're hard for me to taste the differences in, but there's a lot more similarity among Brazilian coffees than there is among coffees from other regions. Even though Brazil produces a lot of the world's coffee, it's all relatively similar.
That's the bean itself. It's not the roasting process?
Yeah, that's in the raw coffee, the green coffee itself. There's a few different theories as to why that is.
Huh. Well, and when you were in Colombia then, what was your day like there?
The first half of my trip to Colombia, I was actually attending a conference and just kind of sitting in on lectures and panel discussions and really just kind of getting some education in for myself that way. It was a conference put on by a different coffee importer, one that's actually based here in Portland, called Sustainable Harvest. And every year they have a conference called Let's Talk Coffee, where they invite all of their coffee producing members, all the people that they buy coffee from. They pay for airfare and accommodations for all the coffee growers to attend the conference. And then they also invite the coffee roasters that they sell coffee to attend. I was in pretty much an observer role there, where some of the other coffee roasters were getting to meet and make business transactions with the coffee growers. Some of the other roasters that were there were folks like Green Mountain Coffee and Delano's and Cafe Ladro up in Seattle, some bigger names. But I was there really just to kind of listen into the lectures at the conference.
To absorb it.
Exactly. It was my first trip to coffee producing country, so I was a little bit wide-eyed.
Was there much of a language barrier?
At first there absolutely was. When I arrived in Bogota, I was traveling by myself and just kind of dumped into the Bogota airport at 7 a.m., which was bizarre. It was mostly Colombian business travelers, and not a lot of folks in Colombia speak English. No one in the airport spoke English, so I was just kind of wandering around aimlessly until I spotted some other Americans who were traveling to the same conference and decided to tag along with them.
That's when a journal comes in handy and you just start drawing. It's Pictionary at that point.
Exactly. None of them spoke great Spanish either, and we ended up in kind of the wrong part of the airport, in the wrong customs line, kind of wandering the tarmac between gates. And all these Colombian customs officials and militiamen, basically, with assault rifles, were just looking at us funny, but no one questioned us.
I remember decades ago, when my very first time traveling abroad and being in an airport and seeing the weapons like that, and just being an American traveling to a country where like you see these rifles in an airport. I remember how disconcerting it was. And I'm sure for you, that was just kind of like, whoa, what did I get into?
Especially with my first trip down to South America, being in a country with a little less than savory reputation for American travelers. In the past, Colombia has had some issues with American travelers, but recently it's much, much nicer.
You know, we didn't make it to Colombia on our trip down there, which was really unfortunate, but I've heard some really amazing things. And I think that they're open to tourism and to travelers, and it's a beautiful country. And
absolutely,
I need to get there.
I've been thinking a lot about how much I want to go back to Colombia.
And spend more than a couple days.
Exactly. You know, I was fortunate that after the conference was over, I got to do some traveling with some coffee farmers and visit their farms in a different part of the country. So we took a day and just kind of traveled by minibus. And
you got about 5 miles. It took like 8 hours.
They drive really fast there. They drive really, really fast there.
Is it one of those things, we ran into this in Peru, where they're hauling ass and they go around a corner, instead of slowing down, they just honk? Did you notice that?
There was definitely some of that. It was, you know, when we were leaving the conference to go with these farmers, they told us, oh, it's only like a 4-hour drive. But then we looked at the map and realized it was about 800 miles. It ended up taking us 12 hours, but if they'd been traveling on their own without a bunch of Americans with them, it would have been a really quick trip over the Andes through these, 12,000-foot passes. And
they have no fear. It's like a bunch of teenage boys behind the wheel, you know?
Exactly. It was a little terrifying.
Your butt was clenched the whole time.
Just about it.
Well, do you have any trips coming up? You know, have you ever thought about getting over to Africa or Indonesia?
I'd love to travel to Africa. I'd love to travel to Ethiopia in particular. I don't have any trips planned for myself right now. Usually they kind of come up. I find out about them about 3 to 4 weeks ahead of time. So it's usually a little bit of a last minute. And I'd love to travel to Ethiopia, but I think realistically that's not in the cards. African coffee travel is a little bit trickier. Also, it's a little bit less transparent, the coffee industry over there.
That's too bad.
Yeah. The Ethiopian and Kenyan governments and Tanzanian governments tend to kind of interpose themselves as middlemen in the coffee trade. There's not a lot of direct farmer to roaster communication there. And there's not a lot of opportunity for it either. So it would be a trip that I would love to go on so I can learn more, but I don't know that it would be a trip that would be particularly valuable to Water Avenue Coffee.
Yeah. Do you think that in the future, maybe those relationships will be easier and it'll be opened up more? Or is it just something that you think it's going to be like that for a while?
I think it's probably going to be like that for a while. There's a couple of things going on in the Kenyan coffee industry right now that are less than ideal for folks looking for a transparent supply line. In the last cycle of elections there was some more autonomy granted to local government as opposed to central government. And some of the local government officials took that as an opportunity to close down some coffee mills and funnel all the coffee through their friends' mills. And in Ethiopia, it's kind of the opposite scenario where the central government is actually interposing itself more and more. I think it was in 2008, they founded the Ethiopian Commodities Exchange, and that is the primary exporter for all Ethiopian coffee now. And it's a Western-style commodities exchange where they're not looking at coffee as a artisanal product and more of a commodity product. It's the same exchange that's trading soybeans and oil nuts and
chocolate and all that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, in Ethiopia, there are ways around it with co-ops that are certified as fair trade. They get an exception. But once again, it's kind of macro level traceability as opposed to micro level traceability.
Well, maybe someday you can get over there and see it. But for now, you got to spend more time in Colombia and Brazil and some of these other Central American countries.
I would love to do that. A lot of my coworkers have gotten to travel to El Salvador over the last couple of years, and I'm thinking that next year that might get to be my trip is go down and visit with the Menendez folks, or Cuatro M.A. Coffees is another producer that we work with directly down there.
Well, you need to, the Water Avenue will set up your trip, but you need to figure out a way to tack on a couple weeks just for yourself.
Exactly. I need to figure out a way to do a little more exploring when I'm there.
Yeah, I mean, you take advantage of these opportunities.
Yeah.
If anybody had any questions for you, is there a way that they could contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. My email address is Aaron, Aaron, at wateravenuecoffee.com. And that's Water Avenue is all spelled out.
And I'll have that on the website as well. And if you had advice for anybody who was just passionate about coffee but didn't really know how to get involved or get into this, what would you say to them?
I think the best way to get involved in the coffee industry is really to start kind of from the bottom up. Most folks I know who are in the roasting and green buying sides of things started as baristas. That's kind of the entry level position in the coffee industry, and finding a roaster who is roasting coffees that you like and just hanging around and asking questions is a great way to go about it.
Anything else you'd like to share with us?
I just want to say that in the coffee industry, the guys who are doing all the hard work are in the countries that are producing the coffee.
Yeah.
They do 90% of the work. We just have to make sure we don't mess it up in the end.
You don't burn it.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us about your coffee travels.
Thanks for having me in this afternoon.
For additional podcast and travel-related articles, you can visit us at thejohnsonway.com and check out our Facebook page. For questions, comments, or if you just wanted to send me a quick hello, you can email me at Angie@thejohnsonway.com. Thanks for listening.